the more I've had to adapt spiritual peace rather than psychological peace. Psychological peace was the beginning, it was not the end. And psychological peace has a lot to do with safety. So people want to feel safe. Nothing wrong with that, but you have to understand what you're seeking. Spiritual peace has to do with trust. Thank you for joining us here for this video. We've noticed that there are a certain percentage or a high percentage of our audience haven't subscribed to our channel. If you can please click on the button to subscribe to the channel, it will help us create more content. It will help us, which will help us reach more amazing people like you, to support them, to serve them. So please click on the subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next video. Thank you. Bye. So that's the track I want to take it to, but I will start with this. I'll start with the story. The story is this: years ago, when I went on this journey, of trying to discover what was important to me, what I wanted my life to be about, what I wanted to do, what were the things. There were a lot of factors involved in there. There was a thought that I had, is that I was looking for peace, but I didn't know what that meant. And it was vague, it was abstract, and over the years that concept has grown. It's become more and more specific. Now I'll talk about what that is. And a lot of times I had a couple of clients. One of my clients years ago, when I did a session with him, he didn't know if I had it or not. He's like, I have a feeling you have peace within. I don't know how I know that, but I have an instinct that you do. I just want 15 minutes of that. And that went well. He got a lot more than 15 minutes. But the problem was that he didn't know what he wanted. Actually, the thing he wanted is not the thing he got. The outcome was similar, but the thing he got was completely different. That's what I want to speak to. And in my journey, I wanted psychological peace, and everybody should want that. What does that mean? Psychological peace is that we're in a state of calm, exactly as you described it. We're centered, we're grounded, and we're not thrown off by a lot of fear, a lot of chaos around us, or reactions to other people, that we can regulate and manage our psychology. That's psychological peace. And I'll walk through a few cards around this, and I want to compare and contrast here. So this is why the first card I have is psychological peace equals less fear and resistance. So we also seek that in our business. Like when I'm trying something, in the beginning, you have a lot of resistance to reach out to people, to find leads, to connect with people, whether those are investors, people, whoever it might be, or to put yourself out there, to even declare that I'm doing this thing. There's a lot of internal resistance. And there's a reason. I'll speak to that. But spiritual peace is different. And I'll speak to spiritual peace because a huge contrast. Spiritual peace equals purpose. Has very little to do with less fear, less resistance, has a lot to do with purpose and meaning. And when I say spiritual, I actually don't just mean it in a religious context. I mean it I don't care if you consider yourself an atheist, if you have meaning and purpose that you're striving or seeking, or you've developed, or you're working towards, you're going towards that. You're seeking purpose. And it's a human thing. It's not even a religious institution. But of course, the religious institution speaks the language of purpose. They speak the language. This is why science doesn't speak the language of purpose. It speaks the language of how, a lot of times, how things work. Even though we frame it as, oh, why does that happen? It actually just explains the how. The why goes towards the meaning and purpose thing. And that's very individual, and it's also subjective to different groups. This is why we have so many religions, so many ways of doing things, so many spiritual practices of all kinds. And that's, by the nature of it, is subjective. But it connects to the deeper truth. And I'll make a couple other contrasts, and I'll talk about why it's so important for you in your personal life, in your legacy with your kids, in your business, and all the things that you're doing in your life, because it'll be and the thing that I'm getting you to understand is your aim. Most people don't know what their aim is. As soon as you figure out what your aim is, you put energy in the right places, and that's what I want to do. and get you to direct energy in the right places. Psychological peace has to do with comfort and rest. So when you're in comfort and you're resting, psychologically you're at peace. We actually have a term for it. I've talked about it before. It's rest and digest. In biology, we have a term for it, and that's a biological and physical and psychological state is rest and digest. The opposite of is fight or flight. The fight, freeze, flight response is when your body's not, like when your psychology is wired to protect you, when your body is all of a sudden moving, and they're both interconnected. Now, what is spiritual peace about? It's about movement and growth. It has nothing to do with rest. It has to do with movement and growth. By the way, that doesn't mean you're always busy, because that's a different thing. That's still a psychological problem. But movement and growth is something else. So there was a story of this Persian author, this Iranian author who was a religious scholar. He was telling his story. He was born in Iran, and he was talking about the regime in Iran that was a communist regime at the time. And they were, interestingly, the communist regime was working closely with the religious group to overthrow the king, the Shah, in Iran. And those were weird allies, because the communists don't see religious people in a positive light. They're atheists. But they allied with each other at the time. And then as soon as the Shah was thrown off, the king was thrown off in Iran with the help of CIA, thrown off, the religious sect took over completely, and the communists were thrown out. And the interesting observation he had is that the communists were the intellectual class of the time. They were intellects. They thought about things. They created the plans and everything. But when the time came for movement and action, it was actually the religious group who actually put their lives on the line to make it happen. Now, that could be for the good and the bad. So I'm not condoning or anything. And this is why spiritual movements can happen for positive and negative at the group level. It's the same for individual. The same spiritual movement and energy that comes, it can have but it has very little to do with comfort. Nobody will claim in a time like that they were comfortable. People will go through wars. In fact, people fight in the name of God, in the name of all kinds of things. Why do they do that? Because there's an energy behind it. Now, of course, they're directing it in a way that's destructive, but it's the same exact energy. So it has to do with movement and growth, and I'll talk about how we leverage it. Psychological peace has to do with safety. Now, think about there was a contrast between, for example, the Republican states and Democratic states when it came to COVID. And it speaks to the values. A lot of the same thing I noticed in Canada. For example, Canada, as a culture, like a bigger culture, they're very much invested in safety. And of course, everybody should be to a certain degree, but their highest value was safety. So this is why Canada was shut down for 2.5 years, literally and everybody was in their own corners. Democratic states, very similarly, in California and New York, safety was a very high value. Even though freedom is a very high value in US, safety took over that. Republican sides didn't follow that model. In fact, they followed the complete opposite, because they had a different value, which was freedom. They didn't want to overwrite freedom for the sake of safety. And those are opposing things. Now, I'm not saying safety shouldn't be there, but those are different values. And psychological peace has a lot to do with safety. So people want to feel safe. Nothing wrong with that, but you have to understand what you're seeking. Now, here's what spiritual peace has to do with. It has to do with struggle. Complete opposite. And we know that the theme for human beings is that struggle leads to freedom, and that's spiritual freedom. That could also be political freedom, and that can lead to progress, which is connected again to growth. And I'm pointing to these concepts to make it more and more specific here. And I'm going to do a couple of more cards, then I'll come back. Last one, I think this one you will understand. Psychological peace has to do with knowing the outcomes, certainty. And this is the part that should hit in the nail. When your mind knows the outcomes and it's certain, then it operates very well. When it doesn't know the outcomes, it goes into chaos. Oh my God, what's going to happen with this? What's going to happen with that? The fears come in, the resistance come in, all kinds of stuff. Spiritual peace has to do with trust. This is why people say when faith is there, there's trust. But trust in what? And the reason why I'm sharing all these contrasts is to help you understand what is your greater aim in this process. And the more I've been on a journey of growth, the more I've tried to build a life that is based on growth, that is based on, think about these terms: growth, freedom, dealing with fears. The more I've had to adapt spiritual peace rather than psychological peace. Psychological peace was the beginning. It was not the end. I needed enough psychological peace to think a little bit more clearly. But as soon as I was able to do that, psychology didn't have answers anymore for me. It did not, because all it could give me is momentary peace of mind, and then I was done. But here's the problem. We live in a world where chaos and uncertainty is a natural part of life. And I want to share a little bit about the history of this. Where is this value difference coming from? Why do some cultures, some people tend to be more safety driven? Some people tend to be freedom driven. So for example, culturally, if I were to contrast Canada versus US, Canada is very free, US is very freedom driven as a whole. There's a high, this is why there's risk in capitalism, there's risk in war, there's all kinds of, for the good or bad, you can decide that of them. Now, for example, you take Canada, very safe country. They make progress too, but they tend to be more on the safe side. In war, they're on the safe side. They tend to be somewhere in the middle. And emergent situations, the same thing. Even their border policies, all kinds of things, like it points to the same. Even when you go, so I've traveled all over US and Canada. It's interesting. When I go to campgrounds, for example, in Canada, I can almost 8 out of 10 times somebody will come in and point something that is not safe or it's not good for somebody or something like that. I've traveled all over US. Not once has anybody come to me and said, why do you do, and I've done all, I test things out. I do weird things. Just let me see, is this group going to do the same thing? Whether I've been in the South, East, West, nobody says anything. They leave you alone because there's like the freedom values is very dominant in the culture. And you see that. But there's another thing. So if you go back to the 20th century, and a lot of people don't know that there's a huge influence of philosophers in a culture. And a lot of this comes from the secular movement. The secular movement in response to, and this started way in the 16th century when the church started going against, when the secular movement, scientists, philosophers, scholars started going against the church. And it was a power grab. It was like, okay, now we know a little bit more about this thing. Your power is corrupt, and to their point, church was fairly corrupt at that time, and it had a lot of power. But what happened was they started creating a completely different belief system, and that belief system has one foundation underneath it, and that foundation is this: that is when they started understanding more and more about where we are in the universe, and that thing was they're in a tiny little blue dot in the middle of the blackness of space, hurtling through space, and they have no idea what the hell's going on. And everything in nature is trying to kill them and eat them. From animals to storms to earthquakes, and they better protect themselves individually, but the species as a whole too. And that psychology runs in every kind of materialistic, secularistic type of scientists. Not all of them, but it's the underlying factor, it's the underlying thing that drives the secular world. And then in contrast to that, there's the spiritual world, which has a different thing. And actually, Einstein was the one who popularized this. And interestingly, he asked this question. He said, the most important question to ask is whether or not the universe we live in is there to, and I'll paraphrase it, to hurt us or help us. And at least in his mind, he's like, no, it's not there to hurt us. But if you look at it from a materialistic, secularistic point of view, every evidence points to the fact that everything is trying to kill us. And on the surface, that's true. But the more we're even understanding about sciences, about how we're understanding about ecology, there is an intelligence system around us. And the spiritual beliefs, what they have asserted is that if there is an intelligence, then if we believe that that intelligence is there to support us, and at the minimum it's neutral, it's not trying to hurt you, it's there for its own sake, that's the minimum side of it. At the maximum side is that it's actually trying to help you. It's just that the struggle you're going through, it looks like it's trying to hurt you, but what it's doing is it's pushing you towards growth. That's where belief comes in. It's not even belief. There's an inner trust. There's an internal trust in the greater scheme of things, that no matter how things look like, things will come to pass and I will grow in the process. And every time, and the reason why I'm going through this long process, whenever I work with clients, the more they understand this energy, the more they realize that they need to move away from psychological safety. They need to evolve into spiritual from psychological peace to spiritual peace. And that doesn't mean they have to become more religious or they have to believe in a religion, any of that stuff. It just simply means that there's a deeper energy within them, and there's an intelligence around them that takes care of things that they are not aware of. And they don't need to actually even blindly trust it. They start to experiment with it, with their intuition. They start to look around them. Things start to come together for them. A lot of people call that, law of attraction, all kinds of things. All this, and nobody understands this. Anybody who claims to understand it, they're just, because we don't know how to test a lot of these things scientifically. We know how to test it in our own experience, though. And all you have to do is look back in your experiences and look at the struggles that you've gone through. What have those struggles done for you? If you've paid closer attention, you will know that you've grown through those struggles individually, even the worst of circumstances. Somebody has lost body parts in war, or they've gotten really severely ill. Somebody has lost a child. Somebody has been part of war. I come from a world of everybody lost every possession they had. But you know what took them through that process? It was not let's be safe, because nobody felt safety in war. What kept them sane was that they trusted that things will work out, and this is a test process for them to grow. Almost every one of them explicitly or implicitly believed, usually through their religion, because it's embedded into pretty much every religion that I've seen. That kept them not only psychologically sane, but it helped them see something beyond what was obvious, what was apparent. And one of the most common questions, for example, secularists and atheists will always say is that, well, if God was this and the other, why would there be suffering? Why would there be pain? Well, that is a very surface view of looking at things. And again, I'm only bringing the language of religion into this so we can kind of make sense of it. I'm not telling anybody to believe something. But what I am inviting everybody is that if you're gonna, and this is where it connects, if you're gonna build a life that's a little bit different from others, and this is where the crux of it is, most people have a life of comfort, especially in the Western world. They have a life of comfort, they have a life of safety, they have a life of not too much fear. What are those things? Those are psychological, that's psychological peace. They actually already have it. But the problem is that as soon as and then the more psychological safety they have, the less purpose they have in the process. And as soon as the purpose gets disappeared more and more, all of a sudden they get to a point where everything becomes dull. The things that they were interested in, they're not interested in. People leave relationships and they will say something like, I'm not happy. People leave businesses, they will say it's too hard. People don't put in extra effort because I don't know if it's worth it. And they slowly veer towards an area of, we call it comfort, but comfort is a medium point. It's a resting point. It's not the end point. The next level is always towards meaning. And as soon as you bring meaning, purpose, vision, legacy, things shift. Now you're starting to think beyond yourself. You're starting to think bigger. You're starting to think beyond your life. You're thinking about, well, what would my, I'm thinking about great grandchildren. What would happen to them? I don't need to think about whether they should remember. A lot of people make legacy about, oh, well, people have so much ego that they want to be remembered after they're dead. Like, no, I don't want to be specifically remembered, but I want to pass on something that is important to me, that will live on beyond me. And my kids and grandkids and anybody that I've touched, they will carry that forward. They don't need to remember me. They just need to carry that energy because I feel a sense of connection with whatever I'm passing on. I feel a sense of purpose. I feel like that is a part of who I am. How do I know that? I know that through my story. I know that through my vision. I know that through the things that I'm interested in. I know that through the struggles I've gone through. And so this becomes more and more relevant as soon as you create a path. You're starting a business. You're starting a life that is different. You're creating freedom, a version of that freedom, whatever that looks like for your family. You're creating a legacy. All of that requires spiritual peace, not psychological peace. Maybe the starting point of it is psychological peace. But as you move forward, it becomes more and more, goes more and more towards spiritual peace. And part of this week's journey that we have is, and we're talking about inspiring greatness on Thursday. What is that thing that you're passing, that you're creating, that is creating that meaning and purpose in your life, that is dealing with some of the hardest things that are around you, whether that's struggle, that's hardship, that's everything that is hard to do. And what are you passing on exactly? What is that legacy that you're passing on? And are you clear? And as soon as you become clear about that, what comes in is motivation. What comes in is a deeper sense of connection. What comes in is a level of effort that most people can't think of. What comes in is growth. What comes in is community. What comes in is impact. And that's what we're trying to create. And that's the path of leadership. It's and this is why your energy goes in a different place. Now you're not seeking comfort. Your value system is shifting more and more towards, it's not about me anymore. And it also starts to move away from the ego piece of it, is that, oh, it has to be about me. It never was. I'd love for you guys to put in the chat, what was the biggest insight, if there was any?